Rome, 401 AD. You are a fuller, a textile worker running a thriving shop in the Trastevere district. Your trade depends on one thing above all others, a constant pressurized flow of clean water piped directly into your basin from the Aqua Traiana, one of Rome's 11 great aqueducts. Without that water, you cannot clean cloth. Without clean cloth, you cannot work. Without work, you have nothing. This morning, the flow has slowed to a trickle, a crack in the pipe, someone says. No, a section of the channel was damaged in a skirmish near the Janiculum Hill 3 weeks ago. The repair crews haven't come, they may not come. The empire has been stretched thin. Alaric and his Visigoths are camped outside the walls for the second time in 3 years. You walk to the public fountain at the end of your street, dry. You walk to the next one, a thin, muddy stream, a line of 40 people waiting with jugs. By the time you reach the front, there is nothing left. You go back to your shop and stare at the empty basin. Your neighbor, a farmer named Quintus, left the city a year ago. Everyone thought he was a fool. He had a small plot of land 3 miles outside the walls, and he dug a well. At the time, it looked like a step backward. Rome had aqueducts. Rome had fountains on every corner. Rome had running water in the homes of the wealthy and public baths that could hold 3,000 people at once. Why would anyone dig a well like a peasant? Today, Quintus has water. You do not. This isn't historical fiction. This is the documented reality of Rome's infrastructure collapse, one of the most dramatic and instructive economic autopsies in all of recorded history. And it contains a pattern so consistent, so repeatable, that it appears in every modern infrastructure crisis, from Detroit's water crisis in 2014 to California's grid failures in 2020 to Lebanon's complete utility breakdown in 2023. Here's the thing that most people miss when they study Rome. The financial collapse and the water collapse were not separate events. They were the same event. The aqueducts didn't fail because of a technical problem. They failed because maintaining them required money, which required a functioning state, which required a stable currency. When the currency was debased into worthlessness, the maintenance stopped. When the maintenance stopped, the infrastructure crumbled. When the infrastructure crumbled, the city became uninhabitable. By 600 AD, Rome's population had collapsed from 1 million to somewhere between 20 and 30,000. Not because of war alone. Because the water stopped. I went through the forensic record, the archaeological surveys, the papyri, the Roman administrative documents, the medieval chronicles that recorded what people actually did and what actually held value when the taps ran dry. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which 4 analog assets survived when the greatest hydraulic infrastructure system in human history collapsed, and which investments evaporated faster than water in a broken aqueduct. The mechanism, how water became an economic asset, and how it collapsed. Before we get to the assets, you have to understand the scale of what Rome built, because the scale of the collapse is proportional to the scale of the system. At its peak in the 3rd century AD, Rome operated 11 major aqueducts, some stretching over 50 miles from their mountain sources to the city. The Aqua Claudia, completed in 52 AD, carried water across arched spans that reached over 100 feet in the air. The combined daily output of Rome's aqueducts has been estimated at over 1 million cubic meters of water per day. That is roughly equivalent to the daily water consumption of modern Los Angeles. For a city of 1 million people in the ancient world, this was extraordinary. It was the single greatest infrastructure achievement in human history up to that point. And it was not merely a convenience, it was the economic foundation of the city. The public baths, the thermae, were not just bathing facilities. They were the social infrastructure of Roman commercial life. Business deals were struck there. Legal negotiations were conducted there. The largest bath complexes, like the Baths of Caracalla, could accommodate 1,600 bathers simultaneously and employed hundreds of workers. All of it ran on aqueduct water. The textile industry, fullers, dyers, laundry workers, ran on aqueduct water. The food service industry ran on it. The fire suppression system ran on it. Urban sanitation, such as it was, ran on it. The city was not merely connected to its water infrastructure, it was built around it in every economic, social, and physical sense. Then came the pressures, the same pressures that debased the currency. Military overextension, fiscal deficits, political instability. By the 3rd century, the emperors who had once competed to build new aqueducts now lacked the resources to maintain existing ones. Maintenance of the aqueduct system required a dedicated workforce of specialized engineers, surveyors, pipe layers, and maintenance crews. It required a steady budget. It required a functioning state bureaucracy to manage it. All 3 began to dissolve simultaneously. The collapse followed a pattern that will feel familiar if you've watched the financial forensics on this channel. Stage 1, deferred maintenance. Small leaks go unrepaired. Sedimentation in channels goes uncleared. No single neglected repair is catastrophic. Collectively, they compound. Stage 2, partial failures. Individual aqueducts begin underperforming, pressure drops, distant neighborhoods lose flow first. Stage 3, crisis repairs and political blame. Authorities promise restoration. Some repairs are made. The underlying resource problem is never solved. Stage 4, major structural failures, either from deferred maintenance, military damage, or both. Stage 5, system abandonment. By the 6th century, most of Rome's aqueducts had simply ceased to function. The pattern is mathematical, predictable, and the families who understood that pattern did not wait for stage 5. Asset 1, private wells and cisterns, the infrastructure you control. Here is the brutal math of infrastructure dependency. Every liter of water that flows through a public system is a liter you do not control. You cannot repair it. You cannot reroute it. You cannot maintain it. You are a passenger in someone else's machine, and when that machine fails, your thirst is not the priority of the people responsible for fixing it. The Romans who understood this built redundancy into their personal lives long before the public system showed visible signs of failure. Private wells in Rome and its surrounding territories appear extensively in the archaeological record. The Pompeii excavations, preserved because of Vesuvius, not despite it, show that even in a city with excellent municipal water infrastructure, a significant portion of households maintained private cisterns fed by rainwater collection or dug wells into the underlying water table. Wealthy households often maintained both, a connection to the public aqueduct for convenience and a private cistern as backup. The cistern was insurance. It was analog. It could not be shut off by a government decree. It could not fail because a maintenance crew didn't show up. It sat there, full of collected rainwater, available at the moment the public system went down. Here is what the historical record shows about what happened when the aqueducts began failing in the 4th and 5th centuries. Population did not immediately flee Rome uniformly. It evacuated unevenly. The neighborhoods that depopulated fastest were those entirely dependent on aqueduct flow, with no alternative water source. The neighborhoods and districts that maintained habitation longer were those with natural wells or proximity to the Tiber, an alternative, if impure, source. By the time Pope Gregory the Great was writing his letters in the late 6th century, describing a Rome that had shrunk almost beyond recognition, the remaining population had clustered in 2 areas, near the Tiber, and in the low-lying areas where the water table was shallow enough to reach with a simple well. The people who had analog water infrastructure survived the collapse of the public system. Those who had only the public system did not survive in that location. The lesson is not about wells specifically. It is about the principle. Any critical resource that flows through a centralized system you do not control is a vulnerability. The analog equivalent, the version you own, maintain, and access independently, is the insurance policy. In Rome, it was a cistern. In modern terms, it is any self-sufficient version of something you currently receive from a system you cannot influence. Asset 2, agricultural land with natural water access, where the calories were. The documentary record of late Roman and early medieval Italy tells a story that is startling in its clarity. As the city depopulated, the countryside gained population. This was not random migration. It followed water. The villa system, the large agricultural estates that had produced food for Roman markets, had existed for centuries in the Italian countryside. Under the empire, many of these estates had been primarily oriented toward market production. Cash crops, wine, olive oil, wheat grown for sale in the city markets. This was profitable when Rome's currency was stable and Rome's population was consuming. As the monetary system collapsed and the urban population contracted, the market for cash crops shrank. But the estates that were positioned near rivers, springs, and reliable natural water sources did not lose their fundamental value. They lost their market orientation. They pivoted to subsistence. And subsistence, in a world where the urban food distribution system was failing, turned out to be exactly what held value. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, in his forensic study of Rome's collapse, documented the archaeological evidence of what happened to agriculture in the 5th and 6th centuries. The evidence shows 2 distinct outcomes depending on geography. Estates depended on irrigation from engineered channels tied to the aqueduct system. These failed. When the aqueducts failed, their productivity collapsed. They were often abandoned. Estates positioned near rivers, springs, or with sufficient rainfall for dry farming. These survived and in many cases became more valuable, not less. The collapse of urban supply chains increased local demand for whatever could be produced nearby. The person who could grow food and had water to grow it was, in the most literal sense, holding the most valuable asset in a collapsing economy. There is a pattern here that repeats across every economic collapse covered on this channel. In Weimar Germany, rural farm families faced hardship, but not the starvation that hit urban workers. In Venezuela, agricultural families maintained food security that urban apartment dwellers could not. In Zimbabwe, subsistence farmers endured Mugabe's catastrophic mismanagement more stably than urban professionals who depended on a functioning market economy to eat. The variable that separated the surviving agricultural estates from the failing ones in late Roman Italy was water independence. Land fed by engineered systems failed with the systems. Land fed by natural sources survived because the natural source did not depend on the state to keep flowing. The analog asset was land with its own water, not land connected to infrastructure, land that could function without it. If you're starting to see the pattern that the assets which survived Rome's collapse are almost identical to the assets that survived Weimar, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe, hit that subscribe button. This channel is forensic history applied to the present. It's free. Unlike the lesson you're about to get from the next collapse, which will cost considerably more. Now back to what held value when the water stopped. Asset 3. Practical hydraulic skills. The knowledge that couldn't be debased. When a system as complex as Rome's aqueduct network begins to fail, there are two categories of people: those who need the system to function, and those who know how the system works and can create alternatives without it. The Roman labratores, the surveyors and engineers who designed and maintained the aqueducts, possessed knowledge that was extraordinarily valuable precisely because it was rare and practical. They understood gradient calculations, sedimentation patterns, spring finding, pipe laying, cistern construction, and waterproofing techniques using Roman concrete. This knowledge did not disappear when the empire weakened. It dispersed. The historical and archaeological record of early medieval Italy shows something remarkable. The same hydraulic engineering knowledge that built Rome's aqueducts appeared, scaled down dramatically, in the construction of monastery water systems throughout the 5th and 6th centuries. The monasteries that became the stable institutional nodes of early medieval European society, Benedictine foundations in particular, were almost universally built with sophisticated water management systems. This was not coincidence. The knowledge transferred from the declining imperial infrastructure to the rising monastic infrastructure through people. Engineers who had once worked on imperial aqueducts, or who had learned from those who did, applied that same knowledge at a smaller, more local, more sustainable scale. They built spring boxes, gravity-fed channels, cisterns, and settling tanks for monastery complexes that needed reliable water. The monasteries that succeeded in early medieval Europe were, in a very practical sense, the organizations that had recruited or trained people with hydraulic knowledge. The skill itself, understanding how to find, capture, direct, and store water, was worth more than any financial asset during the collapse because it could not be inflated away, confiscated by decree, or devalued by a government printing too many coins. This pattern is documented across collapses in different eras and different contexts. In Weimar Germany, skilled tradespeople, plumbers, electricians, carpenters, maintained economic function throughout the hyperinflation because their output was immediately consumable and could be exchanged for goods directly, bypassing the worthless currency entirely. In Venezuela, mechanics and medical professionals continued to function through the Bolivar's collapse. In Zimbabwe, farmers who understood agronomy maintained food security that the currency could not provide. In Rome, the hydraulic engineer who understood how to build a gravity-fed spring system was the equivalent of these figures. The knowledge was analog, held in a human mind, expressed through trained hands, not stored in a financial account or tied to a system that was failing. It could be applied at whatever scale circumstances allowed. When circumstances no longer allowed imperial-scale aqueducts, it built monastery-scale cisterns. When the urban economy failed, it built rural estate water systems. The skill scaled down without losing its fundamental value. Here is the forensic conclusion. In every collapse, the people whose value was expressed through what they could do, not through what they owned in financial terms, maintained the ability to generate economic exchange even when the formal economic system stopped functioning. Practical hydraulic knowledge was Rome's version of this principle. The physician who could treat fever without hospital infrastructure. The engineer who could find water without a state bureaucracy to pay for it. Asset 4. Community water networks. The infrastructure of trust. The final asset that survived Rome's water collapse is the least tangible and the most durable of all. But the Roman evidence for it is extensive. When the great aqueducts began failing and the public fountains ran dry, water did not disappear from Rome entirely. It became local, private, and managed through social relationships rather than through state infrastructure. The historical and archaeological record shows the emergence of what historians of late antiquity have called micro-hydraulic communities, small groups of households, usually organized around a shared well, a shared cistern, or shared access to the Tiber, who developed informal systems of water distribution and management among themselves. The Roman insulae, the apartment blocks that housed most of Rome's urban population, that survived the collapse and maintained habitation, did so primarily by developing shared internal water management systems. A ground floor cistern maintained by building residents collectively, a system for collecting and storing rainwater from internal courtyards, a shared agreement about use priorities during shortages. None of this was organized by the state. None of it required functioning aqueducts. All of it required what economists would now call social capital. existing relationships of trust and mutual obligation between neighbors who had invested in those relationships before the crisis required them. The documentary evidence from late Roman Egypt, preserved in papyri that survived the desert climate, shows village water management agreements that operated largely independently of the imperial infrastructure. When imperial control of irrigation systems weakened, village communities did not simply stop farming. They organized themselves around local water management agreements, maintaining canal systems at the village level through collective labor obligations and social enforcement mechanisms. The villages with strong pre-existing community structures maintained agricultural water management far longer and more effectively than those without them. The pattern is identical to what the forensic record shows in every collapse covered on this channel. In the Greek crisis of 2015, the communities that maintained stable local economies through capital controls were those with existing networks of trust and mutual exchange. In Venezuela, the apartment buildings that maintained relative safety and resource sharing during the worst of the collapse were those where residents had built relationships before the crisis made those relationships necessary. In Argentina, the barter clubs that emerged after the 2001 Corralito froze bank accounts were almost always organized by people who already knew and trusted each other. Community is infrastructure. It is the infrastructure that functions when every other infrastructure fails because it does not require a budget line, a state bureaucracy, or a functioning currency. It requires only pre-existing human relationships, and those relationships, unlike the aqueducts, do not require maintenance from a government that is busy collapsing. The Roman evidence is clear. The communities and neighborhoods that survived the city's depopulation longest were those where social bonds were strongest and most organized. The completely atomized individual, however wealthy, had no mechanism for surviving the failure of a system that had previously made individual survival possible. Understanding what survives requires understanding what failed. The Roman water collapse destroyed three categories of value with particular finality. Urban real estate dependent on aqueduct flow. At Rome's peak, property values in the city were closely correlated with water access. A domus, a private townhouse with a direct aqueduct connection, commanded a significant premium. Property near public fountains was more valuable than property without access. When the aqueducts failed, this premium did not simply decline, it inverted. Property requiring aqueduct water to function became a liability. You owned a structure that could not support human habitation without infrastructure that no longer existed. Archaeological surveys of Rome show a pattern of complete abandonment in neighborhoods where no alternative water source was available. Not decline, abandonment. The property value collapsed to zero in practical terms because the physical asset required a functioning system to have any use at all. Water-intensive commercial enterprises. The thermae, the great public baths that were the economic and social heart of Roman urban life, went dark in sequence as aqueduct flow declined. The baths of Caracalla, which had operated continuously for over 2 centuries, ceased functioning in 537 AD when the Ostrogoths cut the Aqua Claudia during their siege of Rome. They never reopened. The industries clustered around reliable water flow, fulling, dyeing, laundering, collapsed with the supply. The entrepreneurs who had invested their capital in water-dependent urban enterprises lost everything because the asset their business model required had become unavailable. Speculative urban land not connected to productive capacity. Roman land speculation in the city, purchasing urban property for rental income, assumed a stable or growing urban population requiring housing. As the population collapsed from 1 million to tens of thousands over 2 centuries, the demand side of this equation evaporated completely. Urban rental income denominated in a debased currency became meaningless twice. Once because the currency was worthless, and once because there were no tenants to pay it. Agricultural land near Rome paradoxically held value through the crisis far better than urban property, because agricultural land with water access could produce food regardless of what was happening to the city. The Roman water collapse is not a curiosity of ancient history, it is a template, and the template has modern instances that should command attention. Detroit, 2014. The water infrastructure of what was once the most productive industrial city in America began failing in ways that tracked the Roman pattern precisely. Deferred maintenance compounded over decades of fiscal decline. A population collapse from 1.8 million to 680,000 left an infrastructure system built for a large city being maintained by a tax base that could no longer support it. When the crisis broke publicly in 2014, an estimated 100,000 Detroit residents had no functioning water connection. The neighborhoods that maintained habitable conditions longest were, again, those with alternative water sources or the strongest community networks. The pattern was Roman. Lebanon, 2023. The municipal water infrastructure of Beirut, already strained before the 2019 financial collapse, deteriorated to the point where running water in many neighborhoods was available for only a few hours per day, or not at all. A black market for water delivery emerged, tanker trucks filling private cisterns for cash dollars, bypassing the failed public system entirely. The families who could afford private water storage survived the infrastructure collapse. Those dependent entirely on the public system did not. Cape Town, 2018. South Africa's second largest city came within weeks of day zero, the point at which municipal water supply would have been cut off entirely, and residents would have had to queue at distribution points. The crisis receded due to rainfall and conservation, but the wealthy neighborhoods that navigated the crisis most effectively were those that had installed private rainwater collection systems and boreholes, private wells, in the years prior. The analog infrastructure held when the public system nearly failed. The signal is visible if you're willing to look at it. Infrastructure systems built for populations that no longer exist, or financed by fiscal bases that can no longer maintain them, follow a predictable degradation pattern. The endpoint is not a sudden catastrophic event. It is a slow, compounding series of deferred repairs, partial failures, and service reductions that eventually cross a threshold from functional to non-functional. And that threshold is crossed historically faster than most people expect, and slower than the infrastructure managers admit. Back to Quintus, the farmer 3 miles outside Rome's walls, who dug a well when everyone else was connected to the aqueducts. He did not predict the collapse of Rome's water infrastructure. He did not have access to the administrative records showing that maintenance budgets had been cut for the third consecutive year. He did not understand the relationship between currency debasement and infrastructure investment. He simply understood one thing. The water flowing through the public system came from a pipe that was maintained by people he had never met, funded by revenues controlled by an emperor he would never see, running through a channel he could not repair himself. That dependency felt comfortable when the water ran clear and the pressure was good. It felt less comfortable when the pressure dropped. It became catastrophic when the flow stopped entirely. The well he dug was not a sophisticated financial strategy. It was a recognition that the most critical resource in his life was flowing through a system he could not control, and that the analog alternative, the version that depended only on gravity, geology, and his own labor, was worth the cost of redundancy when the system was still functioning. He was not a financial analyst. He was a farmer who understood that water doesn't negotiate. It flows where it can, and the person who has prepared a place to receive it independently of any government's ability to pipe it there is the person who still has water when the pipes stop. The four assets that outlived Rome's water collapse: private wells and cisterns, the infrastructure you control, agricultural land with natural water access, where the calories in the water were, practical hydraulic skills, the knowledge that cannot be debased, and community water networks, the infrastructure of trust. What went to zero? Urban real estate dependent on aqueduct flow, water-intensive commercial enterprises, and speculative urban land without productive capacity. The lesson is the same lesson that comes out of every autopsy on this channel. The assets that survive are the ones that do not require a functioning system to hold their value. The assets that go to zero are the ones that only work when everything else is working. The pattern is mathematical. It is visible. And the only question is whether you're reading it before the pressure drops or standing at an empty fountain wondering when someone is going to come fix the pipe. If this forensic analysis gave you a new lens on infrastructure risk, subscribe to Independent Financial Historian. Drop a well symbol in the comments if you're already thinking about your analog redundancies. I read every single one. And remember what Quintus the farmer understood without needing anyone to explain it. A system that someone else controls is not security. It is temporary convenience. Build your own before you need it.